I did want to share and remind everyone that Mara sends out the source sheets after the class. And so I am not able to respond to the many emails that I get with a request for the source sheets. If you can't seem to find the source sheet, check your email, or maybe Mara, you can give some instructions for how to find that or who to email. Mara does send out a PDF afterwards. And I did get a number of emails this week that I was not able to respond to. So although Mara did put my email in the chat, please keep in mind that of late, I have not been able to respond to as many emails. I will, though, respond to a couple of thoughts here today with you. So, as you know, this is a session exploring God's names and characteristics in the Hebrew Bible and beyond. And I shared last time that it's a humbling experience to think about all the different ways that we examine, that we think about spirituality, a higher power, a divine presence in our lives. And it's quite humbling to think about all the different ways that divinity is expressed in the Hebrew Bible. So I come to this with humility. One thought based on, in response to an email I got, was one participant shared that although she enjoyed the learning, she found it troubling that I say God's name in our studies. And I shared last time that traditionally, since about the Second Temple period, which means after 515 BCE until 70 CE, there was a growing practice where Jews did not say God's four-letter name aloud. If you study Parsha with me, for example, generally I do try and not do that. But in a study situation, it does feel a little strange, but at the same time, I don't, for myself and for the sake of our learning together, I do feel comfortable using God's name. And I will continue to use it. If that is not comfortable for people, of course I understand. And you know, I invite you to make your own decisions about what's best for you and what's comfortable for you. When I go to synagogue, I don't come in and say, well, I don't use God's name, the four-letter tetragrammaton I'm repeating myself, the tetragrammaton in synagogue or in a prayer setting. But while we study, I do use it, though it is a balance, and I will be keeping that in mind today as I also make the decision to use it. So one more housekeeping piece, which I think I may have mentioned. It is very difficult for me to pay attention to the chat while I'm looking at you and looking at our material and thinking. So I'm not always able to do that. If I see something pop up, I may be able to respond, but generally speaking, I don't see it. So just please keep that in mind. So one more time, I will put the source sheet in the chat for anyone that didn't see it yet. And share again that Mara will share a PDF afterwards. The document, the Google Doc, will not be accessible after the class. It's only accessible while we're learning together. And I also will share my screen.
You should have the ability to share your screen, Abby.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
No, sorry. Let me try again. It's I'm just finding the right screen on my computer. Okay. And you will likely notice that I look up at my second monitor, which is a little bit awkward, but that's how my work desk is situated. So as Mara said, we do have a lot of text to go through today. Last time we spoke about the name Yahweh, Yud-He, Vav-He, that's used throughout the Hebrew Bible, and we talked about it in different ways. There are debates about the origin of the name Yahweh. Some scholars think that it comes from the Hebrew root He Vav He or He Yud He, which is a form of being or to be. There is a minority opinion that that expresses the idea that the name is actually from the Arabic, since it does seem like the name migrated from the southeast of the land of Israel, and the name might have a connection to the Arabic word for love or loving. So that's something interesting to keep in mind. And we looked at a lot of complexity around the name. On the one hand, God is seen as compassionate, and there are other ways that the name is used and other names of God also, like Elohim, to indicate judgment or discipline. And so I wanted to start us off today by taking a look at a text about Yahweh that encompasses both judgment and compassion. And I'm going to make my screen bigger, and I also will connect it to the name El, sort of a generic name for God in the Hebrew Bible. And we will examine today El Shaddai and Shaddai, one interesting name of God, which you can see appears in the Bible as El Shaddai 7 times, and as Shaddai 41 times, primarily in the book of Genesis and Job. And we will try and understand the meaning of that, both in the text, really to take a good look at the texts themselves, and also for ourselves today, what can those names mean for us, and what they indicate about spirituality and divinity mean for us today. So here is our text, our early text, our first text today, going back to the name Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. And I will go ahead and read it out loud, and sort of, you have the 4-letter tetragrammaton in front of you, and I may interchange a little bit with just the word God. So this set of verses comes after the golden calf episode, where Moses convinces God that God does not have to destroy the Israelites. God can, in fact, be forgiving and compassionate. And we'll see a little of both in this text. God came down in the cloud and stationed himself beside him there and called out the name Yahweh. And God passed before his face and called out, Yahweh, Yahweh, God, El, showing mercy, showing favor, long suffering in anger, slow to anger, abundant in loyalty and faithfulness, keeping loyalty to the 1000th generation, bearing sin, rebellion, and sin, yet not clearing the guilty, and calling to account the sin of the fathers upon the sons and upon the sons' sons to the 3rd and 4th generation. Many of us are familiar with these words from the High Holiday Liturgy, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. But what's left out of the liturgy, and I left it out here also, is the part, the very end of the verse number 7, about God as punishing. There is this tradition in the Hebrew Bible where God is actually, from one generation to the next, holding people responsible. Later, in later texts in the Hebrew Bible, like Jeremiah debates that and says, I'm sorry, no. Only one person is responsible for their own behavior, and reward and punishment. But other texts in the Hebrew Bible, like this one, express the idea that God holds multiple generations responsible. A very difficult idea, and I'm happy that Jeremiah and other texts changed that, and the rabbis also kind of, to some extent, sided with Jeremiah. So I bring this text just to show the complexity of God's name, Yud He Vav He, and we're going to shift gears, and I'll invite you to think about further complexity. What is complex about the name El Shaddai or Shaddai as we make our way through various texts together? And I want to start off by sharing with you just a few pieces of helpful information. I think when we think about El Shaddai, scholars consider this an archaic form of the name of God. It is not, in all the many years that biblical voices and writers are reflected in the corpus of the Hebrew Bible, it is an older name, and it is connected to the surrounding cultures of Canaan. And El was considered a high god, or one of the highest gods of the polytheistic pantheon. Many scholars, like Robert Alter, and here's his quote, which I think is very beautiful, so I'll read it for you. This is an archaic designation of God that emphasizes God's terrific power. Very beautiful phrase, though the etymology of the second word is disputed. And that's what we're going to look at together. What does, or what could Shaddai mean? Which meaning makes the most sense to us based on both the Hebrew Bible and commentators and some modern writers? So let's read some text together with El Shaddai in those passages, in the passages that we read. And then I'll pause for some questions and reflections. So I do want to ask for a reader for a few texts here for 4, 5, and 6. You can see they're pretty short. You don't have to read the notes, but I would like another voice in our Zoom room today to read verses 4, 5, and 6. And of course, you can say God's name, however is comfortable for you. Paul Wilson, thank you so much.
4, 5, and 6.
4, 5, and 6, exactly.
Now, when Avram was 90 years and 9 years old, Adonai was seen by Avram and said to him, I am God, Shaddai. Walk in my presence and be wholehearted. Set my covenant between me and you. I will make you exceedingly, exceedingly many. And El Shaddai.
And just go ahead to text 5. We'll skip the notes for now.
May God, El Shaddai, bless you. May he make you bear fruit and make you many, so that you become a host of peoples. Shall I continue?
Yep, text 6, thank you.
And may God Shaddai give you mercy before the man, so that he releases your brother to you, and Benjamin as well. And as for me, if I must be bereaved, I must be bereaved.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. I very much appreciate your reading. Let's summarize and analyze these verses together. So in multiple texts in the book of Genesis, the phrase El Shaddai is used when someone is blessing someone else, typically the ancestors, the forefathers. So God blesses Abram. God introduces God's self to Abram and says, I am God Shaddai, walk in my presence, be wholehearted. We're going to make a covenant together, and you are going to have many, many descendants. You can see here, I cited a few other pieces that Everett Fox, translator and scholar of the Hebrew Bible, says, don't be fooled, Shaddai is an obscure name. However, there is this promise of fertility in the ancestor passages about the Hebrew Bible. So Shaddai could be connected to fertility. And in fact, in Hebrew and in the Hebrew Bible, Shaddai means breasts. And there is this sense that perhaps Shaddai is connected to fertility as signified by a woman's, as symbolized by a woman's body and by her breasts. And also Jewish Study Bible notes here that in addition to the sense of blessing and multiple descendants and fertility, there's a sense here that God is extremely powerful. If God is entering into a covenant with Abram or Avram, God is doing so, expressing God's power to be able to enter into that covenant. And then as we continue, we see that Isaac also blesses Jacob. And the fertility blessing here is very explicit. May God make you bear fruit and make you many. Jacob then blesses Judah, one of his sons. And Judah is known as the brother who becomes the leader of the brothers of the 12 tribes, even though he's not the oldest. That happens multiple times in the Hebrew Bible. And Judah is also the name of the southern kingdom of ancient Israel. Ancient Israel was in the north, ancient Judah was in the south. We often refer to them somewhat interchangeably, but the Jews come from the people Judea, and Judah is this significant brother. And so when Jacob blesses Judah, Jacob says, God Shaddai will be merciful with you. And this is not exactly related to fertility, but perhaps indirectly it is, and I'll share that. So that he releases your other brother to you, and Benjamin as well, Benjamin as well. And as for me, if I must be bereaved, I must be bereaved. You may be saying, I don't understand this verse. What is the context here? I made a note up here without going into too much detail about the Joseph saga and the multiple layers and kind of different stories folded into that one novella, that one saga. Jacob blesses Judah as Judah is getting ready to go back to Joseph and try and make sure that Jacob wants to make sure that Benjamin stays safe. And also there's another brother based on one strand of the story who's in custody with Joseph. So there is this sense of long-term fertility. In other words, if not all the brothers make it out of the saga alive, we can't possibly have the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Jacob blesses Judah so that the line of Israel continues into the future. And you can see, we won't read them word by word, but I do want you to just have the opportunity to see Jacob eventually blesses Joseph, the favorite brother. Jacob blesses Joseph, also using the word God Shaddai, and very beautifully and clearly in verse 48, you can see, by your father's God, El, may he help you, and may Shaddai give you blessing. Blessings of the heavens from above, blessings of ocean crouching below, blessings of breasts and of womb. So again, we see here to kind of wrap up these Genesis texts, you can see there's a sense of blessing, fertility, maybe also mercy is mentioned. And there's a personal relationship that God has with these ancestors. And also, if I didn't say it already, a sense of power that God is able to offer blessing in these ways to the ancestors. So I do want to pause here. You can see I even, I wrote a question. This sense of being a fertility, a power to offer blessing and fertility, and perhaps a protector or a power. Do you see that in the text? Is there anything different that you might want to add to our analysis so far? Or are there perhaps questions that you have? So I would love to hear from you.
So Laura in the chat, people are still writing in, so excuse me, I'll try and scroll up. Says that it seems like El Shaddai was the name that Jacob and his family used for God. And God references that when speaking with Moses. So I'm not, do you want to speak to who is using this?
Yeah.
This name?
Yes, indeed. The forefathers are using this name, but God is the one who introduces God's self for the first time to Abram as El Shaddai, God Shaddai. And as you mentioned, Lara, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, and we'll see in a moment here in Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, God says, I was seen by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Shaddai, but my name, God, Yahweh, was not known to them. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was not known to them. That's not exactly true, because in the book of Genesis, Yahweh is also used in connection with the name of God and God's connection to the ancestors. As you probably have heard on my teaching before, on other people's teaching, there are some of us look at the Hebrew Bible with its multiple layers and multiple writers or traditions. That's probably more accurate. Traditions that were pulled together and edited, or depending on how you think about the process, layered on top of each other. And in what scholars consider the priestly strand, Yahweh, God, was not revealed to the forefathers until Moses. But if we look at, as Robert Alter does, the book, the Hebrew Bible as we have it, as a literary whole, it is slightly problematic, since we do have Yahweh and also Elohim and also El Shaddai used with the forefathers. All those names are used. Okay, Heidi.
Thank you. Hi. I'm just curious about the context, or the historical context that all this is happening. Like, as though there may have been lots of other gods around us, but we suddenly had this sort of enlightenment to see this particular superior god. So were there a lot of like female deities around at the time, hence the connection with the breasts and fertility?
Okay, very interesting question. So the fertility gods, there were female goddesses that were eventually written out of the Hebrew Bible for the most part. There's a Hebrew goddess Asherah, or Asherah, for example, and she is described as God's consort at one point. But overall, as you likely know, God generally appears as masculine and as the sole God without a partner. In terms of other gods, the process of Israel adopting Yahweh as their God was slow and complex, and historians don't definitively know how or why that happens. There are many studies about it. Some scholars say that Yahweh, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, is a name, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that comes from the south or the southeast. There are, in biblical poetry, like the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, the Song of the Sea, and there's one more poem that's escaping me, where God is mentioned as coming from the south. So it does seem like, and yet that's Yahweh coming from the south. It seems like slowly over time, Israel took on this name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and we don't see that directly in the text. We have to, as close readers of the text, try and figure out what happened. And there are scholars who study this and write copiously about it. One fantastic scholar is Mark Smith, and his work, I forgot the name of his book. I have it somewhere here nearby. Maybe it's like the early history of ancient Israel or the early history of God. I can't quite remember. And he also has videos on YouTube that are wonderful. He is a wonderful scholar, and you can just see his menschlichkeit, his kindness coming through. So I suggest his book and his reading. But we don't definitively know. We do know that there were these different ways of relating to God and different names of God, and they somehow all came together. And I'll have last time, I think it was Jay, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned at the very end of our session, when we talked about Yahweh as compassionate and Elohim as a judgment-oriented God, that perhaps sometimes we need both aspects of God. And I shared that, reflecting on how Jews have adopted both aspects in daily liturgy, where Shema, the line from Deuteronomy chapter 4, uses both names. And also when we say traditionally blessings over our food, traditionally we also say Baruch Atah Adonai Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. So we encompass both those names. El Shaddai is only in our liturgy once, in Psalm 91. An excerpt from it comes in the evening service, but it did not make it into the liturgy as much. And there's another Adonai Tzvaot, a God of hosts. That's another name that did make it into our liturgy that I'm hoping we'll get to explore next week. So many different names, different ways of relating to God. Not totally clear how the names and the were finalized in the history of ancient Israel and then the Jews, but that did happen, and I definitely suggest some of the detailed scholarship with theories on that. So Heidi, thank you for that wonderful question that helped us add many layers to our learning today. So you can see here that, as I mentioned in Exodus 6:3, we do kind of get a summary of the name Shaddai, and God is described as not being known to the forefathers as Yud He Vav He, as I shared. That's not completely accurate based on the whole of the Hebrew Bible. But as we continue, I want us now to think about not only El Shaddai as appearing to the forefathers, as appearing as somebody who, or a being that blesses, that offers fertility, that offers protection. I just want to show you that one piece about protection that I didn't highlight before. Bear with me for a moment. In Genesis 28, when Jacob has the experience of seeing a ladder and beings, holy beings going up and down the ladder, there are also verses about God protecting Jacob there. That the phrase El Shaddai is not used a few verses down in the context of protection, but that sense that Jacob is also protected by God is in Genesis 28 too. So I want to add that to the mix. Blesser, protector, a fertility power, very powerful. And think about, okay, let's see how the ancient rabbis, how they understood El Shaddai. And do we think the way that they understood El Shaddai fits with the Genesis text? And then I hope we'll even add some later texts, which you can see down here from Ezekiel, from the book of Ruth, and other texts also, to round out our sense of the way this term is being used and what it can mean for us. So text number 9 is from the Babylonian Talmud, and Reish Lakish was a sage who appears quite a bit in the Talmud, and we're going to read just a snippet of an interpretation from Reish Lakish about how he understands God. I want to mention here that you can see the translation of El Shaddai here in the Sefaria translation, which is the website and other educators often use to pull text. And Sefaria, I think, uses the Koren edition of the Talmud. The phrase Almighty God is used. And if you are looking at any standard or almost any Bible, not the more modern translations, but many other Bibles will have that as a translation, because the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from about the 200s BCE, I can't recall the exact date, that was translated in Egypt to Greek, which was the spoken language of the Jews, translated El Shaddai as something like Almighty God in Greek. I don't remember exactly what, like a powerful God. And that's the name that often you'll find in translations. Now, what we're doing today is looking at the original Hebrew, and we're really asking, okay, if we encounter Almighty God as a translation, is that accurate? And that's the question at hand that I want us to be considering. So we're going to read this and see what El Shaddai means according to Reish Lakish, and then according to Ibn Ezra, two sages, Ibn Ezra, an early medieval rabbi from Spain. I can add his year here. So I'm going to go ahead and read the Babylonian Talmud text to see what layers are added here. Reish Lakish said, "What is the meaning of that which is written, I am El Shaddai in Genesis 17? It means, I am he who said to the world, enough, instructing it to stop expanding." And I'll keep reading and then you'll see what it means, and I'll also explain a bit. It means, similarly, Reish Lakish said, when the Holy One, blessed be he, created the sea, it continued to expand until the Holy One, blessed be he, rebuked it and made it dry, as it is stated in Nahum, a minor prophet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry and desiccates all the rivers. Nahum, the prophet, is talking about God's ability to control the natural world. And Reish Lakish knows this verse And in trying to understand Shaddai, he's actually saying that from the Hebrew dai, which means enough, he's saying Shaddai means that which is enough. The shin can mean that or which in Hebrew, and he's putting those two things together and saying the word Shaddai means enough. So you might be wondering, wait a second, all the earlier texts are about God's massive power, God's ability to offer blessing, God's ability to cause a nation of fertility and many descendants. And now Reish Lakish is saying, well, maybe Shaddai means that which is enough. It is a little bit confusing. One possible way of looking at this is that God's ability to be powerful and to choose to bring something powerful to us also means that God can limit God's powers in whatever ways God chooses. God can also, we can also experience divinity as being limited and also as being expansive. So let's hold that thought about Reish Lakish. And now we're going to read Ibn Ezra, a medieval rabbi who cites the Babylonian Talmud text, doesn't mention Reish Lakish, but does cite the Babylonian text, and then goes on to offer some more classical meanings for Shaddai, and we'll pause after that for some further discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and read this text too. First, Ibn Ezra says, guess what? We know this already. The word Shaddai is difficult to explain for any Hebrew readers. He says, Milat Shaddai kashe b'peirush, difficult. Sadia Gaon, an early medieval rabbi, a Gaon from Baghdad, a wise sage, literally a bright one from Baghdad, said that the shin of Shaddai is a prefix, as we read in the Babylonian Talmud, like the shin prefix to she'ata, that is you, in a verse from Judges. The context does not matter at all. In the book of Judges, there's a verse that says, she'ata midaber imi, that you talk with me. Same idea, says the Ibn Ezra. So the meaning of Shaddai is who said to the world enough, as we read in the Babylonian Talmud, or who is enough, meaning God is expressing God's self as an entity that is enough, or because God is enough, God also controls or sets limits on what is enough in the universe. So different ways to think about this enoughness. However, says Ibn Ezra, I cannot see any meaning in this interpretation. Commentators do this all the time. They cite something that they completely disagree with, and then they try and prove their point otherwise. How can God be called by the name who is enough? Shaddai can only be an adjective, as in, you, God, are good and forgiving, tov v'salach, meaning in other places in the Hebrew Bible, God is forgiver, God is good, and God is described in an adjectival kind of way in Psalms. That must be the case when we use the word Shaddai, a God who is something, an adjective. My heart within me aches, another verse cited here. Let me just see if I can find that. I think by accident I deleted that. Hebrew, oh, I did. Okay, in oh no, I didn't. Al libi davai. This is another example of a three-letter of another way that God is describing God's self as God's aching heart because of the behavior of the Israelites. And it's just another three-letter description. It's perhaps not an adjective, more of a verb. It's not so clear, but nevertheless, Ibn Ezra cites that. And now he says, let me tell you what I agree with. Shmuel the Nagid, also an early medieval rabbi, explains Shaddai with the Arabic word al-kahar, which means victorious and mighty. The Arabic root doesn't necessarily connect. It doesn't connect to Shaddai, but it does mean in the Arabic translation, in Shmuel Hanagid, Samuel the Nagid wrote in Arabic, and he's saying he said it meant Menatseach v'takif, victorious and mighty. And he goes on to explain further examples, which I read in the original. I won't go through the whole text here, but he gives examples of how the root, in the same way that Shmuel HaNagid claims that the root of Shaddai is actually Shin Daled Daled, there are other ways in the Hebrew Bible where that third letter of the Hebrew root changes. Like, for example, I left this off here. Let me show you an example here. In this phrase, this word here in Hebrew, bazu, the actual root, says Shmuel HaNagid, quoted by Ibn Ezra, is bet zayin zayin. Now, we don't know yet what the meaning of shin daled daled is, but Ibn Ezra is making the point that that third letter root drops off sometimes. And it's true, that happens in Hebrew. So an example here of a word that means divide, rivers dividing in the land, is that zayin drops off in the same way that dalet drops off. So we're going to see a commentary in just a moment that explains that shin daled daled means to intervene, perhaps similar to power or mighty or might. But for now, let's conclude the Ibn Ezra, where he says Shaddai, as in the sound of Shaddai, or a mighty sound, and also Shaddai will be your treasure, or mighty shall be your treasure, are examples of Shaddai as a mighty being or a mighty entity, like a treasure that's mighty or a sound that's mighty. If you're wondering, like, if you're saying to yourself, like, I don't totally understand what Ibn Ezra is doing here, it's not 100% clear what Ibn Ezra is doing here. He's not necessarily making very clear, and there are commentaries on this commentary, but he's trying to figure out, how can I say that Shaddai actually does mean mightiness or might? And he does that with a verse from Ezekiel, which says the voice of Shaddai and or the sound of Shaddai. And Ibn Ezra seems to understand that as the might of Shaddai, the strength of Shaddai. And the same goes for that Job verse. So there are examples that may be a little bit of a stretch. There are other ways that Ibn Ezra could have cited the word shin daled yud to mean might or strength. But here in this case, he cites these words here that mean, to Ibn Ezra, might or strength, and he lands on the idea that Shmuel HaNagid, Samuel the Nagid, this early medieval rabbi in Spain, he explains it well. Ibn Ezra's last line here is v'yafeh peresh. He explains this well. So rather than the Talmudic interpretation that Shaddai means Shaddai, that which is enough, it doesn't mean that, says Ibn Ezra. It means might or strength, as we can see from other verses in the Hebrew Bible. So along Ibn Ezra, and we'll read one more commentary, one more modern commentary in a moment that elaborates a little bit on the idea of shidud as intervention, another form of might, or an offshoot of might, of God's might. But for now, let me pause and see what your thoughts are on, does it make sense to translate Shaddai as that which is enough? Or does it make sense to translate Shaddai as might or strength? Which is resonating more for you? And certainly if you have clarification questions, please ask those also.
Abby, it's always fun when there's sort of too many comments to address quickly, but I do think that we had an earlier comment that was talking about Shaddai on the mezuzah.
Oh, yeah.
And how in that case, like, really being a guard of doors makes sense. But so can you speak to sort of the way this name of God interacts with the mezuzah?
Okay, so on the mezuzah, the scroll, but encased in a case with the Shema in it. On the back of the scroll, there's this tradition to write God's name, Shaddai, Shin Daled Yud. It's not clear when that entered into Jewish practice, but as you can see, I quoted a Maimonides text. Maimonides died in 1204. So there was already the custom by 1204 to write Shaddai on the back of the parchment. And many mezuzahs, or mezuzot, but I'll say mezuzahs, many mezuzahs, the tradition is if you can't actually see, it used to be that mezuzahs were made where you could see the shin from the case. If you can't do that, that's why if you go to a Judaic store, you'll see that many mezuzahs have the shin, or most of them really, have the shin on the case as a representative of God's name. Now, Maimonides goes on here, and you can sort of glance at the text or read it on your own. Maimonides goes on about how there are some superstitious practices connected to mezuzah, but Maimonides does not agree with those. He doesn't explain further. He just mentions the custom. It does seem like the mezuzah was some kind of an amulet, some kind of an object that was supposed to bring us safety from harm. Maimonides was not a fan of superstition, but it does make, it's interesting that the word Shaddai, that's the name of God that we did place on a mezuzah rather than Yud He Vav He. There is an acronym to the word Shaddai. Rabbinic texts say that the acronym in Hebrew is the following, and then I'll translate: Shomer Dilatot Yisrael, keeper, guardian of the doors of Israel. So whether or not somehow Shaddai migrated as a name from the Hebrew Bible onto mezuzahs, and then that explanation was given after, or somehow because that is an acronym you could read into the word Shaddai, if that was the reason that Shaddai began to be written on the back of the parchment, it's not clear to me. And I didn't see anything. I could not find anything that actually told me which came first and how early the practice was. But there is the sense that we take of God as protector. And I think that goes back to Jacob a little bit and the ladder story, where Jacob does mention that God is a protector. So in all those Genesis texts where God is very powerful and brings promising blessing and fertility, there is that Jacob text. And you could say that the texts in general in Genesis speak to God as a protector. And that's the connection to the mezuzah, that Shaddai is also seen as a protector of our homes. So if you have any follow-up questions to that, feel free to ask. And then also just thinking back to our rabbinic interpretations of Shaddai as either enough, Shaddai, that which is enough, or might or strength. I do want to ask if people feel that either one makes the most sense or resonates with them.
People are free to continue using the chat, and also yeah, I think we can have some raised hands.
Okay. So our reader Paul has a question, and Jay does also. Jay, I'm going to actually call on you first. Paul, you'll forgive me because we haven't heard from Jay yet today. So Jay, go ahead, and then Paul after that.
So I was thinking about all the qualities of the name Shaddai, El Shaddai brings, and you mentioned among them fertility, power, breasts, meaning nurturing, bearing fruit, mercy, long-term relationship, protection, almighty, gratefulness, maybe enough is gratefulness, and forgiving. Those are qualities that I think fit perfectly with the mezuzah. Who wouldn't want that in their doors?
Okay, thank you. Jay, just one follow-up question. You mentioned Shaddai as forgiving, but I wanted to know what you had in mind.
I thought you had said
Might have.
goodness and forgiving at one point. Maybe I was wrong.
Oh, okay. So two possibilities. One is when Jacob blesses Judah to have a safe journey back into Egypt, God says, Jacob says, may God grant you mercy. So that's similar to forgiveness. And also maybe from the beginning of our class today, when I was sharing that Adonai and El are both used in the context of the 13 attributes of God, but also God as who can be a punishing God. So it might be that you're thinking of.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul.
Very briefly, because I don't want to monopolize. The enough is enough, Dayanu, has resonated with several chatters. But my initial point would be God's strength was his voice. That is how he created everything. And as we are created in his image, going back to the fertility motif, what is a higher issue of humanity, made in his image, male and female, mind you, to be fruitful and multiply, other than to create life. Q, a child is born. Q handles unto us a child is born. I believe that the voice is the power of God, and indeed for us as well. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very beautiful idea, that God as creator, God brings the world into being, says Genesis 1, with words. That chapter uses the word Elohim for God, but still the sense of God's voice and a connection to the commandment to fertility, also connecting to the word Shaddai, which Ibn Ezra cites a verse from Ezekiel where Shaddai is used as either God's voice or a mighty voice. It's not so clear. So there is a connection there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want us to take a look at one modern commentary and then take a few minutes to look at the ways in which Shaddai is used in some other biblical texts beyond the Torah itself. And we'll end on a contemporary note also. So I would like to ask someone to go ahead and read out loud this Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, Rav Kook as he's known, who died in 1935 and is considered the first Ashkenazic rabbi of mandated Palestine. And I think he sheds a little bit of light, and it's a very beautiful text on El Shaddai and also on Yud He Vav He. So can we have another reader to read this Rav Kook text for us? Okay, great. Susan, thank you very much.
The name Shaddai comes from the word shidud, meaning to intervene. This name for God implies occasional divine intervention in the natural realm. This was the degree of providence that the Avot, forefathers, experienced. They lived in a world of natural forces with occasional miracles. They were but travelers in the land of Israel. God was thus revealed to them as El Shaddai. With the formation of Israel as a nation, however, the special providence or protective care of God or of nature as a spiritual power of the land of Israel became the Jewish people's permanent inheritance. The generation of Moses was granted a higher revelation of God's providence, as reflected in the name Yud He Vav He. This divine name comes from the word lahavot, to cause to exist.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Susan. So I think in some ways, Rabbi Kook rounds out our brief exploration here of a couple of rabbinic texts that really look at, for the most part, not as much the interpretation that God is enough, which is, it can be a little bit of a disconcerting kind of interpretation, though I did hear a couple of people share some other interpretations, as did I, but more so God as very powerful. And Rav Kook adds this sense here of God as an intervener from the root Shin Daled Daled, and also God's special protection, which we've talked about. And then Rav Kook expands on that a little bit and also adds the piece about Yud He Vav He coming from the root being, which we talked about last time also. So not only is God a power, a significant power, but an aspect of that is that God sometimes intervenes in at least the lives of the ancestors, perhaps our lives also. So I wanted to share with you also and make sure that we ground ourselves in other texts from the Hebrew Bible. The first text here, again, is about God's power and the voice, as Paul was highlighting for us, the voice of El Shaddai. Here we have Ezekiel saying, Kekol El Shaddai B'dabro, in this vision that Ezekiel has when God leaves the temple, as the exile is beginning, as the temple is on its way to being destroyed. There's the sense that God is leaving the holiness in the temple. And in that description, Ezekiel says the voice of El Shaddai is something we can hear. On a different note, going back to the piece about fertility, you may be familiar with the verses in Ruth in the first chapter, where one of the key characters, Naomi, says, don't call me Naomi, call me not Mara, but Mara, call me bitterness, different names, different meanings for that name. And she says, Shaddai has made my lot very bitter. Shaddai has brought misfortune upon me. What does she mean by that? There could be different circumstances here that she's referring to. She had been a woman in a family of means. She is no longer a woman in a family of means. Her husband has died, her sons have died, her daughters-in-law are left with her. And she says here, well, I also where am I going to get, she's actually saying, where am I going to get descendants from? I don't have that promise of fertility. That doesn't apply to me. And there's another strange kind of verse in Psalms that uses the word Shaddai about God perhaps causing snow on Salmon. I wrote some notes here from Robert Alter, I believe, who says, we don't really know what this means, but there is a sense in the verse also of God's victory over God's foes. Psalm 91 does something a little bit different, and this is the psalm that is recited very often at Jewish funerals. And there's a sense here, you can see that Robert Alter cites Yair Hoffman, an Israeli scholar, who calls it an amulet psalm, a psalm to bring us some sense of protection, and more so than power is the sense of protection here. So I will go ahead and read the first couple verses. The reason it's color-coded here is from another document of mine where we look at Psalm 91 and the different voices in Psalm 91. You can see that verses 1 and 2 are the writer of the verse speaking, and then God actually speaks toward the end here in verses 14, 15, and 16, and the meanings often, the voice does shift in the psalm. I just do want to ask, not everyone is muted, so if you can mute, there is some background noise. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear clearly on the recording too. So verse 1, he who dwells in the Most High's shelter, in the shadow of Shaddai, lies at night. So a person is protected at night in the shadow of Shaddai. And then the tetragrammaton is used as well as a form of Elohim. I say of God, my refuge, my bastion or stronghold, my God in whom I trust. So all these different names of God are being used just in 2 verses. And then the psalm eventually continues where God says, indeed, I will protect this person. I will answer him. I will respond when he's in distress. And I want to suggest that, there are many, as you can see, I've tried to share with you that there are many different ways to understand even one name of God. There's different ways to understand Yahweh and Elohim and El Shaddai and Shaddai. I would suggest, as someone mentioned in connection to the mezuzah, also the meaning of feeling protected when putting a mezuzah on one's door, that although, for example, Rashi does say that Psalm 91 is an expression of God's strength, it's hard to avoid this beautiful and tender sense of comfort that the speaker is getting from being in God's shadow and God's protection. So there are a few other things that I want to add, but let me just say that I hope when we all encounter El Shaddai in our studies, that we acknowledge that perhaps the original Septuagint, the Greek translation, and also one of the rabbinic commentaries that we read, and the Rashi I just pointed out, lands on El Shaddai as a God of strength, a God of power and might. El Shaddai is also associated with a more perhaps comforting sense of blessing and fertility. I'll interpret here perhaps in every sense, productiveness in our lives, and also especially protection and comfort. So there are many other texts here that we did not get to. Especially I wanted to talk a bit about the book of Job and its role in seeing God not just as distant and almighty, but also as inexplicable. There are those senses of El Shaddai, but there is a sense of El Shaddai as extremely comforting. And you can see here, I included a song by Amy Grant, a modern Christian singer. I think she's still living. I don't want to misspeak. I'm not sure, but you can listen to it. You can look it up on YouTube. There's a link here. And she uses the word El Shaddai and also she uses El Elyon in a sense of God being a comfort to her. She is a Christian gospel singer exploring the names of God, not because she's experiencing necessarily only God's power, but also because she's experiencing God's comfort. So Mara will send out this document a little bit later today so that you can really sit with all these different ways of understanding El Shaddai. And I hope it brings you both complexity, but also comfort in seeing El Shaddai as not only a might, but also a protector and a comfort. So with that, I will wish you a good rest of your day, and I will look forward to seeing you next week, for our last of 3 explorations of God's many names.
Thank you so much, Abby. I loved hearing your insights here. I would love personally, and I'm sure everyone on this call also, can we get a little bit of a teaser for next week? Which name are we exploring?
I think we'll probably explore, as I mentioned, El Svaot, God of hosts, but we may explore some other aspects of God too.
Great. So we'll have to tune in. Great. All right. Thank you, everyone. Well, we hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.